Got something interesting for you to start out with this morning. So, 1 Corinthians. The English translation of this phrase is almost always written this way. So we're looking at verse 117, and Paul writes, "Christ did not send me to baptize, but to proclaim the gospel." Proclaim the gospel. That is the English translation of that Greek word. But the thing is, the Greek word is actually very simple. It's a verb, and it means to gospel, or literally, gospelizing. Gospelizing. That's fantastic. Can you imagine if everyone went around gospelizing? It paints a whole different picture than to preach the gospel, doesn't it? Preaching the gospel is great, but gospelizing, there's joy in that. And I think that's what really gets at the essence of what Paul is trying to convey to us about his job and what Christ is trying to do and to show and to call us to, is to be the gospel, to live the gospel as a verb, not as a noun, to go and to gospelize. But to do that, we need to look at how Christ did it. What did he do when he was going about his mission so that we can then go and gospelize ourselves? So, in our gospel reading today, we hear that Jesus left Nazareth and he made his home in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, if you were listening to that Old Testament reading from Isaiah that Doug read for us this morning, you might have heard a little bit about Zebulun and Naphtali and the darkness that they were in. So the backstory to that, to what Isaiah was writing to, is that those two territories had a long-standing domination by foreign states. Their locations made them especially vulnerable to attack. And so as the northern and the southern kingdoms were arguing amongst themselves and all of these things were happening, well, Zebulun and Naphtali essentially existed as vassal states to a series of Assyrian kings. And they were eventually taken into captivity, and that left them in this deep darkness that we hear about today. That darkness was brutality and poverty and hunger and powerlessness. And yet, in this Isaiah reading, the focus is not on the darkness, but on the light. And everything here is attributed to God. It is not the people's doing that will bring about the light, but God himself who will send the light into their midst. We hear that in a latter time, God will make glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, that he will send a light among them. And so, Jesus comes. He enters as God, as that light that has been promised and fulfills this prophecy spoken by Isaiah. It's Jesus' presence that is this light, and it emanates from him. And so all that he does and says and is shares that and spreads it all across the territories. If you ever wonder why it was that Simon and Andrew and James and John could just drop everything, including their father, in a boat and leave and follow this man, especially when he speaks this really strange thing about being fishers of people that probably made no sense whatsoever to them. I know I question it a lot. Why would they do this? But when you think about what it was Jesus was doing and who he was, when you think about that word, gospelizing, it makes a little more sense. When you are being the gospel, there is something about you that draws people in. It's not always what you say. It's not even always what you do. It's who you are. When that light of Christ, of God, lives inside of you, and you commit yourselves to gospelize with everything that you have, well, it brings people close. And so it makes sense then that Jesus could say, "Come and follow me and do strange things," and that people would listen because something about him promised that truth and that light. And so Paul, in his letter to the church at Corinth this morning, our proclaimed emissary of Christ, he seeks not only to do this same gospelizing himself, but to encourage and entice others to do it too. He writes to this church at Corinth, which is settled and embedded in a wider social context of injustice and greed and status seeking and violence, the use and abuse of others, poverty and enslavement as the foundation of wealth. All of this is happening in Corinth. And Paul is writing to these people, asking them, pleading with them to remain strong and bonded so that they don't turn into those oppressors themselves, and so that they can have confidence and strength to fight that oppression and that violence and that negativity that pervades their world. Well, we might not be the church at Corinth, but we are the church in Virginia Beach. And we know that in our own community, these things happen too. We are faced with poverty and with hunger and with violence, seen just months ago at the shooting at our municipal building. And so it is our call to remember to be united, not divided, to be, as Paul says, of one purpose, remembering Christ's call to us, not to baptize or to worry about who is doing what or when or where or in whose name, but to gospelize, to embody Christ and spread that out. But there's another key piece here, because Christ does his mission and his ministry and his gospelizing not just anywhere, but in the lands of Naphtali, in the land of Zebulun. Thank you. Sometimes words. And Zebulun and Naphtali are in darkness. We are called to be the gospel not only where we're comfortable and warm and cozy, but where there is fear, where darkness pervades. So, the call this morning from Isaiah and from Paul and from Christ himself is to be of that same purpose, to love your neighbor, to give food to the hungry and clothes to the naked and care to the sick, to go to those places of darkness and be the light, to gospelize.